Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Welch, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues. On behalf of the Clark Forum and Dickinson College, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's event, World War I Consequences. Tonight's discussion is the second and final panel in our series, World War I Remembered, a Centennial Commemoration. When hostilities ended on November 11, 1918, a period of rebuilding began in Europe. Great empires had fallen, and new nation-states emerged where the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires once ruled. Global politics had changed fundamentally, and the effects of World War I are still visible and important today. Tonight's discussion will address the impact that an international conflict like World War I has on social, economic, ethnic, cultural, and political life around the world. Our panel consists of 4 experts and a moderator, each with a different area of expertise. David Commins is a professor of modern Middle Eastern history at Dickinson College. His publications include The Gulf States, A Modern History, and his forthcoming Islam in Saudi Arabia focuses on Islamic thought and political movements. Dominique Laurent is a professor of French at Dickinson College, where he often teaches courses on World War I and France in the period between 1919 and 1939. His current research focuses on Woodrow Wilson's image in the French press during the Paris Peace Conference from December 1918 to June 1919. Colonel Douglas Mastriano is the Director of Theater Intelligence at the U.S. Army War College here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He received his PhD in history in 2013, and he now teaches in the War College's Department of Military Strategy, Planning, and Operations. Crystal Moten is a professor of 20th century U.S. history at Dickinson College. She achieved her doctorate in 2013 and currently teaches classes on U.S. history, urban history, African American history, and women's and gender history. And our moderator tonight is Wendy Moffat, a professor of English at Dickinson College. Professor Moffat is currently writing a dual biography of psychiatrist Thomas Salmon and World War I war correspondent Elizabeth Shepley Sargent. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. A question and answer session will follow the discussion, so please hold all questions until the end. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Moffat.
Thanks. Thank you for coming. Last night was a marvelous political discussion about the causes of the war from a lot of different perspectives, and so to some degree we are going to follow on that, and we hope that if there are questions that you have left over from last night that now have an impact on our field, that you'll ask them tonight, even if we're not political scientists. It's also kind of daunting to think about the prospect of the consequences of the war. And so one thing I want everyone to understand is that you should be reading the newspaper right now. For those of us who study and write about this period, it's a little creepy to open the Washington Post or the New York Times or a European paper because the echoes seem very noisy to us. So that's my overview, and now I'm going to begin by asking some questions. Everybody's going to talk a little bit, and we're going to try to create a discussion as well. I thought that we would start from sort of the most large geopolitical questions to get sort of smaller and smaller in the range of things. So we begin with Dave Commins, who has some audio-visual or some visual. There we are.
Only visual.
Only visual.
Yeah. I need to practice a few times before I go audio-visual.
So soak it in.
Yeah.
So Dave, how did the defeat of the Ottoman Empire pave the way for today's violence and instability in the Middle East?
I have 7 points in 5 minutes, 4 slides. I hope I can do it. The consequence of World War I for the Middle East primarily was that it redrew the political boundaries. The first slide shows you the Ottoman Empire in 1914, stretched all the way down to Yemen in Western Arabia, to the eastern shore of the Persian Gulf, It encompassed what's now Turkey and the Central Arab countries. At the end of the war, during the war, the British and the French, who were fighting the Ottoman Empire, negotiated a plan to divide the Central Arab lands into areas of direct control and also areas of influence. This is the 1915 Sykes-Picot Accord. That was a secret agreement that the two sides reached in 1915. The Sykes-Picot Accord, in the end, was not exactly implemented. Those are not the boundaries of the Arab countries today, but they anticipated the post-war division of the Arab lands 5 years later, according to the Treaty of San Remo, which looks very much like the formal international boundaries, if not the effective international boundaries of the Central Arab lands today. Now, how did the drawing of these boundaries and the management of populations within those boundaries by colonial powers set in train events that led to the violence that we see today? We can talk about two different dynamics at work. One is a sort of policy of divide and rule that was followed by both the British and the French that accentuated sectarian divisions in Syria, Lebanon, in the French sphere, and in Iraq in the British sphere. I only have one map for Syria. I don't have many more maps. This is my last map. But the Syrian map does a good job of showing how sectarianism was set in play by European colonial powers. At one point, the French divided Syria and Lebanon into states that were supposed to represent majority states for religious populations. So in the northwest, you had a Sunni Arab state of Aleppo. In the south-central part, you had a Sunni Arab state of Damascus. In the far south, the black portion was supposed to be a state for the Druze minority. In the northwest, the orangish was supposed to be an Alawite state, okay, the state of the religion, or the religion that is represented by Bashar al-Assad of Syria. And then you had Lebanon. Lebanon existed in two phases. The first was Ottoman Lebanon, which is the smaller territory, barely visible, centered on Beirut, slightly darker green. And then the French decided in 1926 to create what they called Greater Lebanon in order to make it economically viable. In expanding Lebanon, however, the French incorporated into a mostly Christian territory cities and rural regions that had mostly Muslim populations, putting in play a sectarian balance that was quite fragile. And within that Lebanese arena, the French privileged the Christian population against the Muslim population and played them off against each other in ways that foreshadowed sectarian conflict in that country. In Iraq, the British created a monarchy. They just plucked a guy out from among their wartime Arab allies, who was actually from Mecca in Arabia before it became Saudi Arabia, and put this fellow, Faisal, who had been the king of Syria for about 18 months before the French chased him out, and the British took him and put him on the throne in Baghdad. And the British were able to consolidate their authority over Iraq through an alliance of King Faisal and Sunni Arab notables. Did not incorporate Shiite Arabs to any great extent, let alone Kurds. So that foreshadowed a sectarian style of governance in Iraq. So sectarianism is foreshadowed in the post-war settlement. International conflict was also foreshadowed in the international settlement with the British regime in Palestine, which is off this map of Syria. Okay. Originally, the British mandate of Palestine included both territories, Palestine and then Transjordan to the east. The British decided, however, to exclude Transjordan from any immigration from Europe by Jewish settlers seeking to establish a Jewish state. So they divided Palestine into eastern and western sectors and incorporated into their constitution for Palestine a provision that Britain would support the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, which was a provision construed by Jewish proponents of a state there as a commitment to create a Jewish state. And while the British at times said, well, that's not exactly what it means, in the course of their 28 years of rule in Palestine, the project of establishing a Jewish state was advanced to the point so that when the British finally left in 1948, the Jewish presence was large enough and strong enough to create the state of Israel against Arab opposition, all right, which resulted in the displacement of the Palestinians and the dashing of their aspirations for their own independent homeland, setting the stage for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that has been going on now for many decades. So these are the various ways in which the aftermath of World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire presaged the problems that we face today in the region.
What other stories can the panel connect to current events coming out of your areas of expertise? This kind of destabilization, right? Can you sort of address a little bit of this in other kinds of spheres? Is this true in French colonial Africa, for example, that you see the footprint of Sykes-Picot?
Well, Sykes-Picot only concerned the Middle East, but I'm sorry, Sykes-Picot only dealt with the Middle East. But yes, I think the way the French and the British, to a large extent, carved out the German colonies of Africa also led to problems, definitely, yes. More problem in Zaire now with the old Belgian Congo, and that's not so much a consequence of World War I, but yes, by and large, the legacy of French and British colonialism in Africa, especially the French, unfortunately, is quite bloody.
What is Iraq? I mean, Iraq is a bunch of lines on the map drawn in 1916 that was brilliantly portrayed by you. And this wasn't set up for success, this country. This is why people such as General Qasem in the early 60s and Saddam Hussein later on had to rule with an iron fist, not unlike Tito in the former Yugoslavia. So what do we have in Iraq? These random boundaries drawn really, in a lot of ways, as you heard last night, about oil in many ways. Other considerations, clearly, zones of influence. But mixing up a cabal of Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds, and then lots of subplots within there, Turkmen and Persians, among others, Chaldean Christians, Syrians, and you have a recipe for disaster. A lot of people without anything in common, without a national identity. Saddam successfully did create a national identity, I'd say, and since his removal in 2003, what do you do with this country? Trying to plant Jeffersonian-like democracy overnight in a country with no tradition. You think about our history, we're still sorting it out in a lot of ways. You think about that. We fought a bloody civil war 87 years after the revolution, or after the Declaration of Independence. And even then, all the big issues at hand weren't resolved. So World War I does matter to you. The modern history of all of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, the Baltic states, Ukraine, it really goes back to the post-World War I era. And we're living with that ghost and legacy today.
I want to pick up on that a little bit. There's some very interesting new work by Paul Saint-Amour, who's a literary and cultural scholar. He's interested in the use of air power in the Great War and in the colonial use of that. The dry runs for most of the more advanced air power that went on after the war involved the bombing of civilians in then Mesopotamia, then Afghanistan. This is a very interesting thing to look at because you look at the map and basically there were places that were considered enough wasteland, if you will, that the civilian population wasn't considered that important. One of the early commodores of the RAF, Leo Charlton, quit because the civilian bombing, what we would call collateral damage now, was part of the policy. So you see sort of the germ of air warfare, a certain kind of total air, use of air in relation to infantry, but it's overlaid or so deeply enmeshed in colonialism, you can't distinguish between the two at this
Can I follow that up? So Giulio Douhet came up with the real theory of modern air warfare. He wrote this from Italy, a colonel of artillery in the Italian army. And this whole idea of strategic bombing and what have you that we rely upon in a lot of ways, the roots go back to him. And then, of course, our Billy Mitchell picked up and John Schlechter in the UK. But what happened? The Royal Air Force, although small, was pretty good in the early days of World War II. And why was that? Because they used their air power to police the empire, as Wendy rightly said. What's interesting is a lot of myth came up because there was a lot of propaganda to justify expenditures for the Royal Air Force, because the justification was, hey, it's economy of force, it's clean, we don't lose soldiers because we're not doing fighting on the ground. But that's false. You had 30,000 Indian troops doing the dirty work down on the ground, taking on the Kurds. So yes, the Royal Air Force was dropping bombs and even chemical munitions from time to time on the Kurds, and as well, the Pashtuns in the northwest frontier province, the modern Pakistan-Afghan border. It was troublesome back then as well. So clean fighting, it seems, but really there's a lot of guys on the ground that are still doing the legwork.
Doug, more Doug. The common wisdom about the First World War is that the troops were lions led by donkeys, that the military strategy was ill-planned and the leadership inept. Is this true? What enduring lessons came out of the war for the military leaders who fought it? What impact did the experience of that fighting have on the geopolitical view of the leaders that you know within the military?
Yeah, one day I was on my way to Stuttgart to reach to the Landesarchiv there, a great archive in Stuttgart in Germany. And as I was on the streetcar, another German gentleman hopped on and this polite conversation, what do you do? I forget what he did for a living, but I remember what his response to mine. Well, I'm a historian. And in English, he's like, ha, what a waste. Whoa. So then off the top of my head, I said, let's go back to 1918, 1919. I said, aren't you glad that people such as then Colonel Marshall, General Marshall, had this idea of the Marshall Plan? He saw what happened in 1919 with the Versailles Treaty, punishing, vanquishing the enemies, squashing the Germans and setting conditions for a Hitler, and then creating another war. And I said, there was a lesson learned from that. And as well, as your Hitler was rising to power and causing trouble, the United States had its hands tied. FDR had a Senate and a House that was very neutral and isolationist, anti-interventionist, and wanted to stay neutral. But the lessons that Marshall and FDR learned from the war, whether they were in it or not, was we went into the last war ill-prepared and we paid a heavy price. You think about the last 6 weeks of the war for the United States. All the Allied nations suffered heavily the last 6 weeks of World War I. But we're looking at 20,000 casualties a week on the U.S. side. And these are men charging into machine guns. That's what happens when, you think about this. In March 1917, just weeks before the President Wilson finally entered the war, we had an army smaller than the pre-war Belgium. We had 200,000 soldiers. The Belgians had a larger army in 1914 before the war started. Amazing. So we went from 200,000 soldiers and a year later to over 2 million. That's amazing. But what of the readiness of these guys? Were they ready to fight? Absolutely not. Very few of our divisions were up to the French or British standard. The equipment, we had to beg and borrow equipment from the Brits and the French. Every tank that we drove there, Patton leading his tanks as a lieutenant colonel, every one of those was a French tank. The French were the arsenal of democracy back in World War I. And this is what happens when your nation's unprepared for war. The so what, okay, that's all interesting. The so what is that the world's on fire right now. It's amazing how it's falling apart. I mean, I started off my career 27 years ago in the Iron Curtain, and many of you have served in Germany as well back in the 80s and earlier. And it almost seems like a flash to the future. I'm leaving for Latvia on Friday for a NATO exercise, and it's like, what's going on here? And we have a lot to learn. And the world's on fire, and yet your armed forces is downsizing. So are we up for the challenge? I don't know. Now, I know I'm out of time here, but real quickly, what about the tactics of World War I? I'm sure most of us have watched that Blackadder scene, a tip-top secret plan that General Melcher has of marching slowly towards the machine guns. They tried 17 times before. It's hard not to look with a jaundiced eye upon the leaders of 1915 and 16, when it was really bogged down in trench warfare, 17 as well. But I would say a bit of grace is due them. The French and British and Germans proved amazingly adaptable. They are confronted with revolutions in military affairs, we call it RMAs, that had unforeseen consequences. Looking back, it's easy for us to say, oh, surely the machine gun and the airplane and chemical warfare. They had no plans for this. The plans were largely built around Napoleonic tactics that worked so well 100 and some years before. And this is something that you need in your leaders today. We try at the War College, a bit of advertising here, to endow our strategic leaders, our rising leaders, future generals of your army, with the ability to do critical thinking, creative thinking. We need that because we're surrounded by all sorts of revolutions in military affairs. And if we get it wrong, you can suffer in the end. Surely our soldiers will, but the population now, it's a small world. Just a quick vignette. One of those so-called donkeys in 1915 and 16 was General Allenby. These guys tried all they could to break the trenches. They couldn't do it. This is what happens when you have parity. You know, if you want to win a war, make sure you're better than the other army. And we have parity on the Western Front. It's hard to break it. So Allenby is sent off to Egypt, and he does brilliantly in 1917 and 18 in the Sinai campaign. So I don't think he's much of a donkey. Anyway.
You found one non-donkey there. So where does this very, very hardy myth come from that the war was a military disaster, that there's a generation gap? These are sorts of things that come through the literature and myths. Where does that come from? Does it have a grain of truth?
Well, yes, it does, especially for the French. There's a saying in the French army that the French army is always prepared to fight the last war. And so in 1914, as you said, Doug, they were prepared to fight the Franco-Prussian War. Unfortunately, the problem is the technology had evolved very quickly. You can name it machine guns, you mentioned, but aircraft, submarine, gas, and so on and so forth. And the military leaders did not see it, and the fact, the Americans had a lot of casualty college casualties in 1917, 1918. The French relatively less by then because they had done that mistake in 1914. In 1914, the French army was charging into machine guns with bright red pens that could be seen from way far away, and they made the same mistake. It was only by 1915 that they adopted a different color uniform, a steel helmet, and so on and so forth. So to answer your question, Wendy, the generals were not prepared, and they had not done their homework in terms of looking what modern warfare, modern weapons do, and made terrible mistake. The Chemin des Dames with Nivelles, there was a tremendous waste of human lives because, as you said, like the Americans, the French had not done their homework and were not prepared to the devastation of modern technology in war.
What's even worse is when the United States finally got into 1917, the French and British sent over thousands of military advisors to train our soldiers. And here's one quote from a soldier in the 82nd Division. Foreign instructors arrived to show us the only way to win the war. The French swore by the hand grenade and the Chauchat, light machine gun. The British swore by the bayonet, and we swore anyway, and we kept on working harder. It's sad but true. In December 1918, this is what one officer said. December 1918, a month after the war is over. In reality, we got some excellent training after the war. It is a matter of grave discussion why, when we were at Camp Gordon, Georgia, we were taught to sing, while after the war we were taught to fight. The lessons from the British and French, General Pershing told his officers to ignore them because the Americans will win with élan, the spirit, and the bayonet. The same thing the French army tried in 1914, and they warned us not to do that again because spirit and bayonet does not go against machine guns very well.
Well, this is a political matter, right? Yeah. And so are the red trousers. You know, the emphasis on a certain kind of national identity and a certain insistence on doing things our way keep joint commands and various other kinds of things from happening. So we think of it as a world war, but it was in some senses uncoordinated on the ground, and that if you look at the way the maps are, they'll slice up a line, and they didn't always communicate very well, and that wasn't just a technological, but sometimes a cultural matter. Dominique, what were the domestic political consequences for France after the war? They saw really the bulk of the fighting on the Western Front.
Yes.
They lost, unless you're talking about Russia, a very disproportionate number of.
Right. The French lost, out of a population of about 39 million, 40 million is not clear, 1.3, 1.4 million men, so that's about 6% of the male population of that age, so it's enormous. I was going to talk a little bit about foreign policy before I spoke with domestic. Initially, France was drunk with pride and glory. The war had been awful, 4 years. Every family was affected by losing a father, a son, a brother, and so on. Thanks to the American, the war was won, and the initial euphoria was overwhelming. You know, the French were number one. They were avenging the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War. They regained Alsace-Lorraine, which had been an obsession all along. They saw themselves as the defender, the crusaders of democracy, so there was a lot of pride, which hid the fact that despite the military victory, France had been considerably weakened, number one, by the loss of soldiers. Number two, France was enormously indebted to the United States and Britain, I think to the extent of $35 million, which was, of course, enormous at the time. So basically, among the French, there were, after the war, all the problems disappeared. The motto, the mantra was, Germany will pay. L'Allemagne paiera. It was decided that somehow we will force Germany to pay the debt, the reparation for everything. And initially, the government, the chamber, the House of Parliament, was dominated by veterans. So they were really in favor of a hard attitude, hard policy towards Germany. That was reinforced by the fact that the French made a lot, Clemenceau, the French prime minister, made a lot of concession to the US and Britain at the Versailles Treaty. The French military, in particular Foch, wanted to separate the Rhineland, which is the left bank of the Rhine between the French and Belgian border. I should have a map. They wanted to make it independent as a buffer state to protect the French. And that was a no-no for the British and the Americans, so the French relented because they were not able to impose their view. So they made a lot of concession in order to get a defensive alliance with the US and Britain. And as Doug said, the US became isolationist soon after the war. In November of 1919, the US Senate refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, refused to join the League of Nations, and reneged on the pledge of that defensive alliance. England followed suit right away, so the French found themselves alone, really. And number one, they started cultivating alliance with the small countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia. And the French prime minister at that time, his name was Poincaré. He was from Lorraine, so he was really anti-German. And his goal was to punish Germany. L'Allemagne paiera, punish Germany. And the French were convinced that Germany was dragging its feet, that it could pay, but that they were refusing. And so Poincaré adopted a very firm policy, which culminated by the January 1923 occupation of the Ruhr. The Ruhr region is the most industrial region in Germany around the city of Essen. And in order to pay themselves, basically the French were, well, if the Germans are not going to pay, we are going to occupy the Ruhr and we'll take all the ore, the iron ore, the metal, the coal, and so on. That worked militarily, but of course it incurred the wrath of the German and also of the Americans, the British, who were very much against that sort of strong arm policy. Poincaré was forced to back down, and accepted the Dawes plans, another recalculation of German debt. And in exchange for that, there was a big loan from the Morgan Bank in the United States. So that was the end of the strong arm policy that the French had adopted. And from then on, Poincaré was replaced by the socialists first and then a more moderate regime. And from that on, the French finally realized that they were alone. They could not dictate their will, certainly not to the Americans and the Brits, that they had to work in cooperation with them. And this is the beginning, and I'm simplifying, but of a period of collaboration with Britain and the US and with Germany. And that period of cooperation is embodied by two men. The French Prime Minister at time and Foreign Minister was Aristide Briand, and his German counterpart was Gustav Stresemann. And the two of them achieved a reconciliation. They even got the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, in 1926. So France had abandoned that strong arm policy, and it worked. It worked until basically 1929, and by then, Briand was already talking about the United States of Europe, so there was a really big period of optimism, and the crisis of 1929 came, and as a consequence, a huge unemployment in Germany and so on, and the rise of Hitler. But the French continued that policy of cooperation, which turned into a policy of appeasement. And even after Hitler came to power, even after Hitler made very clear what his intentions were, the French were afraid and convinced that they were no longer able to impose their will. And so as a Monday morning quarterback, a lot of historians have said, well, if the French had invaded Germany to chase Hitler after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, after the invasion of the Sudetenland, Hitler would not have responded, would not have survived. But the French, again, were under that thought that, we can't act on our own anymore. We have to work in cooperation with the American and the British. By then, the Americans were turning their back. And so my point is that the appeasement policy of the 1930s can be seen as a direct consequence of that failure in 1924 of the strong arm policy advocated by Raymond Poincaré. So, of course, it was wrong, but you can see that. Militarily also, there were two military leaders. Foch, who was the general commander of all armies in World War I, he was also very anti-German and advocated strong arm, and he was in favor of separating the Rhineland from Germany. And he was forced to back down by Clemenceau, who said, look, you can't impose that. We didn't win the war by ourselves. We have to obey what the Americans and the British are. The other view was embodied by Marshal Pétain, who was the hero of Verdun, Philippe Pétain, and he was in favor of a defensive system, and he was more in tune with that policy of cooperation. Still, as a military man, he thought our army should be prepared for a defensive war, not for an offensive war. Again, we know that that was a mistake. And the embodiment of that policy was the construction of a very sophisticated line of fortification going from Switzerland to the Belgian border. Belgian neutrality was respected, and so the French built that line, which was named after the defense minister of the time, André Maginot. And that was the policy that prevailed. In retrospect, it was clearly a mistake. It was a mistake militarily, politically, but in order to understand that blindness of French leaders, you have to understand the humiliation and the failure of the strong arm policy in 1924.
What about other domestic situations? Is it a stupid thing to talk about?
No.
Situations?
Domestically, the victory brings about a very conservative, right-wing or nationalistic parliament. It was called the Chambre Bleu Horizon. The Chambre is the parliament. Bleu Horizon, horizon blue was the color of the French army after 1915, and most of them were veterans. I mean, veterans had a lot of prestige, a lot of them ran for election and won, so that was a pretty conservative chamber at the time, and this is a chamber which allowed Poincaré to use that strong arm policy towards Germany up to 1924. And then the left came to power.
We can talk about this all day.
Okay.
Crystal, what about the U.S. at this moment, the immediate post-war moment, the sort of broad political questions?
Yeah, and thinking about the broad political questions, especially as they relate to the meaning of democracy and who can participate in the body politic in the U.S. I'm thinking about what you just mentioned about the conservative right-wing kind of influence in France. When you think about African-American soldiers returning home from the Great War, there was this insurgence of terrorism inflicted upon them by white supremacists who refused to recognize and respect their contributions to the war. And so you think about that in terms of some responses in the U.S. to African American, especially men coming home from the war. Yeah.
David, is there a domestic politics in your sphere of the world, or is it so enmeshed with colonialism?
It's anti-colonialism.
Okay.
It's anti-colonialism. Because, you know, if you have to look for an independent country at that time. And the only independent countries in the Arab world at the time were Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And they were just constituting themselves territorially. They had not yet come close to developing modern governing institutions or politics.
Crystal, you talked a little bit a minute ago about the implications for democracy, and I wondered if you could pull that a little bit further into the 20th century. In what ways do you see World War I having an effect on both the sort of global view of minority populations in the United States and their idea about citizenship? And is there a through line that you can draw to civil rights struggles, or is that just a very tendentious kind of over-reading of causality?
Well, in thinking about this question of global democracy, especially for peoples of color across the world, what we see when African Americans go and they fight in the First World War is you see that there's this expansion and understanding of the diaspora, and particularly the Black diaspora. For the first time, many African American men are leaving the U.S. and they're coming across and encountering people of African descent outside of the U.S. And so what you see is this sense of Pan-Africanism outside of the U.S., and you see Black soldiers encountering French colonial subjects and fighting side by side with them and actually admiring their valor and their bravery. And some of their kind of interaction and understanding is a bit romanticized, but you see them wanting to make connection with their Black brothers who they are fighting with. And so on the one hand, African Americans are being exposed to people of color outside of the U.S., and for some of them, that's a first for them. And the impact that has on them is totally amazing. And thinking about where in the U.S. this idea of racial inequality and white supremacy is absolute, is something that is unchanging. But when African Americans leave the U.S. and they are on European soil, there's this notion, there's this idea, and their dream has been realized that racial equality can be a reality, and they see that in their relationships with some of their colleagues in terms of fighting, and then also in their relationships with French civilians. They really begin to understand and think about a new way to view democracy. On a cultural front, what you also see during this World War I period, especially in terms of African American involvement. You see the introduction of jazz, the music form on an international scene, and you see that through James Reese Europe, who was a band leader who led the 369th Military Band, and he introduced jazz during this World War. And the story that's been told about the introduction of jazz is that when the 369th arrived in France on January 1st, they began playing the French national anthem. And at first, no one stood up. And they didn't stand up because they didn't quite recognize what was being played. Because Europe and his band had remixed the French national anthem. And so once they realized that the band was playing the national anthem, then they stood up and recognized it. And what you see is music becoming a way to expand democracy, music breaking down racial, cultural, and national barriers. And that becomes really important, the impact of culture in breaking down barriers and breaking down global barriers. And so that those two things, kind of thinking about African Americans' interactions with people of African descent outside of the US, and thinking about the importance of culture and music in global democracy, are some of the reverberations. When you think about the 20th century, immediately following World War I, African Americans unsatisfied with the unfulfilled promise of democracy in the US, a new movement emerged, and it was the New Negro movement, which was an intellectual and cultural movement that really built on the feelings and the energies of African American soldiers and international experiences in World War I. But in thinking about the reverberations of World War I up to the present, I think there's still this concern about global democracy and what that means, who can participate, and especially as that results to people of color around the globe.
We saw yesterday that discussion of a sort of socialist, transnational, you see these sort of structures of connectivity, international workers, those sorts of things. And so there are these different kinds of alignments that we're seeing, and the map is getting redrawn, other kinds of connections are getting redrawn. Doug, I don't know very much about the way that the Army worked in terms of racial integration or lack of it in World War I. Could you comment on that just very briefly?
Yeah, there was several regiments made up of African Americans, but commanded by white officers. And strange enough, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force was General Blackjack Pershing, named as such because he led the 10th Cavalry during the Spanish-American War. And that was an all-African-American regiment, which did fantastic at San Juan Hill, fighting alongside the Rough Riders with Teddy Roosevelt. As far as how they were treated in the American Expeditionary Force in France, not well. And in fact, many of these regiments were handed over to the French to lead, still with their white American officers, but the French seemed to handle these African-American regiments better. I don't know why General Pershing didn't step up and kind of really man up in this case and direct his corps and division commanders to integrate these regiments, because he knows the men fought just as well, and in some cases even better than some of the regiments we had out there. Some of the regiments clearly had something to prove. On another side, as far as a national identity, United States, the American Civil War, you see lots if you go to Gettysburg, I'm sure most of you have. There's placards across the battlefield to state regiments, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and on Alabama, et cetera. And what about a national army? World War I is the first forging of a truly national army. So you have people, obviously you saw I wrote on Sergeant York, America's most celebrated hero of the First World War. Alvin York, a mountain man from Tennessee, Nowhere, Tennessee, still Nowhere, Tennessee. And he reports to Camp Gordon, Georgia, modern-day Fort Gordon, Georgia, outside of Augusta. And he's surrounded by men who are alien to him. And these men are from New England. They're alien to him. He's surrounded by Italians from New York and New Jersey. He's surrounded by Greeks, Jewish people from Poland and Eastern Europe, driven out by the pogroms, or as well for economic reasons. And here's one report by the Inspector General of one of the American divisions. Approximately 20% of the men in my unit were of foreign birth, and several hundred were not even citizens of the United States. Training was seriously handicapped by a substantial number of men who were unable to read, write, and in some cases even speak English. As you can imagine, this is a problem when they show up in France. And we have documented cases where men are coming off of patrol in the trench lines coming in, and other Americans challenge them with a password, and they can't understand the reply, and they open fire thinking it's the Germans, and it might be in a group of Italians or a group of Irishmen or Greeks or what have you. But that aside, entire villages, in my case, most of my ancestors came 120 some years ago, so they were part of this group there, and you'll see pictures of my distant cousins with an American flag behind them and an American flag. So it also helped to bring in these foreigners and truly make them American. The experience of the Great War, though, as a whole, started breaking that state identity, and now we started having a national identity. And that's a transformation, really. It's really a recent phenomenon for the United States.
And it's interesting because if you say that the Great War made foreigners Americans, and then you think about the African-American experience in the war, and you think about how the Army shuttled off their troops to the French, and what does that mean about African-American men's ability to attain citizenship and become American through this kind of traditional masculine endeavor? So it's interesting.
It's disconcerting. And
Yeah.
Granted, a lot of African-American soldiers stayed in the American Expeditionary Force, but what jobs were they given? They're basically cleaning up the battlefield.
Yes,
Picking
laborers.
up bodies with the chaplains and burying guys and recovering equipment.
Exactly.
Menial tasks.
Right.
Dave, you looked like you were going to say something a minute ago.
Oh, just picking up on Crystal's remarks about African Americans seeing the promise of global democracy out there, not arriving. And of course, very famously, on the eve of the peace talks, President Wilson came out in favor of self-determination for peoples formerly under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. And the British and the French didn't terribly appreciate that too much, since they were in favor of their determination for those Arab lands. And as the British and the French were determining the fate of the Arab lands, President Wilson, to ascertain the wishes of people in Syria, broadly construed in those times, including what are today Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, President Wilson sent a delegation to tour and ask people there, well, if you had your preferences, what would your political future be? And the majority said we want to be an independent, unified kingdom. Unified meaning all of the Syrian lands, which interestingly is the term Sham, famous now through the use by ISIS. They said our second preference would be to be under the tutelage of the United States. And if not the United States and the British, but we don't want, sorry, the French.
Anybody but the French. That's becoming a kind of theme here
Right.
tonight.
Well, it wasn't anything against the French per se, except that they realized the French were the European power, the Western power, most interested in establishing control and influence over the region. So, global democracy denied.
Yeah. I'm going to ask myself a question, since I am both moderator and expert. We associate World War I with a new type of traumatic battle injury, which a lot of people know as shell shock. Was this really a new phenomenon? What are the long-term consequences of the soldiers' physical and psychological wounds? And this is a transnational question I'd like us to pick up. And then, very pointedly, did the United States take care of veterans? No. Or rather, I think war trauma has been a feature of combat and violence that civilians are subjected to for a very long time. Several years ago, our wonderful Bradley Chair, Jonathan Shays, wrote Achilles in Vietnam, which is a remarkable book in which, going back and using Homer with Vietnam veteran American troops who were suffering from PTSD, really mitigated a lot of symptoms, in part because there was a kind of solidarity with the trauma of war that transcended their personal experience. But it's true that the technology really was, and the psychological inability to anticipate that, particularly with trench warfare, particularly with the British at the beginning of the war, really manifested troops with injuries that the doctors didn't understand and at first didn't even really believe in. And part of this is that they're beginning to sort out the difference between what we would think of as organic brain injury, concussion from explosives, from being hurled, from shrapnel, and then this second set of symptoms that they can't figure out, which they eventually call shell shock. And those are all sorts of neurological symptoms, inability to walk, inability to sleep, nightmares, shaking, uncontrollable shaking, loss of language, loss of particular limb that doesn't seem to be affected by a physical injury. And so they were really wrestling with this question and how to treat it. Now, from the perspective of the combatants, the most terrifying part of this is twofold. Number one, that you're going to, what called wastage, right? You're going to have men who look like they're physically capable of working, but they somehow are not. And so the immediate focus on cures was trying to get men back into battle. This wasn't about psychotherapy and healing people in the longer run. The second thing is that it has a terrible effect on morale. It's very easy to accept that somebody's being taken off the battlefield if they're bleeding heavily or if they look very badly wounded. But both staying in the line and being taken away seemed to pose kind of different kinds of problems tactically for the medical doctors who are handling this. The person whom I'm looking at is an American doctor who had, I guess, the benefit of seeing the French and the British screw this up because they were in the war for a good bit longer. And he actually traveled over to Britain in 1916. He understood, his name was Dr. Thomas Salmon, and he understood that if we were going to enter the war, that it was going to be a massive public health, mental health crisis. And because psychiatry was not accepted in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, in effect, the whole psychiatric apparatus, he was the first psychiatrist in any American army, was shoehorned in because the Rockefeller Foundation said this is a public health matter, and literally the secretary of the Rockefeller Foundation wrote the Secretary of State and said, Dr. Thomas Salmon will be a major, and his handpicked cadre of psychiatric people will be at this, and this rank. So it was as if you sort of brought in your whole team, and that's what he did, which probably didn't make them feel much better about him also. But he had a very interesting advance plan. He had seen what he saw as the difficulty of troops being removed with these neuropsychiatric injuries. And he saw that they didn't get well when they got sent home. In fact, they got warehoused in asylums in Britain and in France. And some of them right up to, Ivor, and now I'm thinking Ivor, I've forgotten his last name now, rather famous World War I poet, dies in 1965, still in an insane asylum. So he gets the idea we have to treat it at the front immediately, and so he creates this extraordinary network of very advanced psychiatric hospitals within 3 or 4 kilometers of the Meuse-Argonne front on the eastern side of France in the latter half of 1918. He has a really simple protocol for the men who get brought in. First, he teaches the division psychiatrists how to tell, and then they come into these little stations that are like a little tent right by the guns. And he says, these men need a hot drink and their own cot. And he's an empiricist, so he's measuring these things all the time. And he gives them a hot drink and a cot, and he observes that they drink the drink very fast, lie down on the cot, and sleep for an average of close to 36 hours straight. Now think about that for a second. What that means. It really means probably battle fatigue, right? Exhaustion, physical exhaustion. And he finds that almost 80% of the men treated this way go straight back to the line very happily. There is a large crowd, of more than 65,000 troops who are psychologically wounded and come home. And that's the next chapter. We enter the Harding administration, which is a terrible vortex politically to enter. And first thing that's very interesting is there's a lot of privatization of hospitals. There's a lot of money to be made in the care of troops. Salmon is partially responsible for the Veterans Bureau, which is the dry run at the Veterans Administration, but he's not successful in getting mental health parity or full treatment for these men, and particularly not for getting state-of-the-art hospitals where they've actually learned some things. And in part of that, Congress allocates $16 million. It's not about the failure politically to allocate. It's about who gets to do it. And they scrap and fight over basically private companies versus the US government providing health care. If that sounds familiar, it should. And so he views it as the signal failure of his life that he wasn't able to do that. So after that, the US Army Medical Corps and veteran stuff in the 20s gets cut by 80%. We're not at war. We don't have to fund war. So if you read, David Finkel's new book, Thank You for Your Service, which is a remarkable book about this, what you realize is that with current Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, we've got a huge mental health crisis right now, and it's only going to get worse. It's sort of, they can do this on a computer. They can tell you there are going to be at least 10,000 cases of Ebola, although only 2,200 people have died so far, and that it'll probably take 3 years to eradicate. We know how big this crisis is that's coming with our current veterans. We can guess, and we don't want to fund it, and we don't want to consider it part of the cost of war. Tell me some other sad stories about injuries, rehab, the cost of war in the other countries.
I'm not quite familiar with that aspect, but yes, as you said, for the French and probably for the British, the main priority was to recycle the students and send them back to the front. So the whole nicety.
Students.
Oh, I'm sorry. Soldiers.
Are you traumatizing your students?
I'm traumatizing my students, yeah, I'm not sure. No, so what the French consider as the niceties of psychological, that was not important. I think there is a famous movie called Behind the Line where it's about the British, and there is a British doctor who is using new methods of psychiatry to help those soldiers, and he watches a more traditional approach where a soldier is given electroshocks until he can speak again, and that's pretty much what the French were doing also. It's just like, get those guys out, torture them basically so that they start walking and then start speaking again, and then send them right back. Another nice method that the French used was in 1917, right after the bloodbath of the Chemin des Dames offensive, where tens of thousands of soldiers, French soldiers, were killed for a matter of hundreds of meters and so on. There were mutinies in the French and the British Army, and the way to deal with the mutinies, surely created or caused by that phenomenon of battle fatigue, was to execute the leaders, and so force again, scare the soldiers to get back into the trench. So that's the semi-medieval attitude that the French had, until after the war, things changed, but until then, it was get those guys back into the front, we don't care how.
I was thinking, Crystal, about your sort of cultural appropriation of this too. I'm on a panel later this week at West Point for the conference that's commemorating, and Heather Perry, who's a historian of Germany, says that there's a very interesting difficulty in the immediate post-war period because there was a great deal of ideological work done beforehand to encourage morale and to sort of cement conscription, that men were virile and whole, and German men especially virile and whole. And when they are faced in the immediate post-war period with huge numbers of very, very badly crippled and injured men, they face a kind of ideological crisis in how they're going to redefine a disabled body as a real German body. You'll have to ask me next week exactly how that's done, because I don't know the full answer, but I think that's such a wonderful sort of difficulty. Once you start a mythology, you live by that mythology. We are pretty much out of time for our talking part because we want to leave some time for your asking part.
It is now time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the mic to reach you, and speak into the mic because tonight's event is being recorded.
Yeah, I had a question about your thoughts on General Pershing and more particularly his thoughts on the African American troops. There's an idea that I've heard lately that General Pershing, with his experience with previously the Buffalo Soldiers and the colored troops, that it was possibly his idea to separate them from the rest of the American command so that they would have the possibility to see combat and be treated as equals. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I honestly don't know what Pershing's plan was when he called up these regiments. You know, from his view, the United States wasn't ready, apparently, to integrate these troops as he did with the recent immigrants to the country, which is a shame. I used to admire Pershing quite a bit as a great strategic leader, but then looking back, the deeper you go, just the guy was overwhelmed. He's got a 200,000-man army, including the National Guard, and then overnight, almost within a year, he's got 2 million on his hands, and the system was cracking. And on top of that, he's dealing with the crisis of the Germans with 1 million men on the front, fresh from Russia, trying to break the French and the British before the Americans can show up with enough forces to make a difference. And so he's divvying up divisions left and right to help fill gaps in the line. So the bottom line is how the African-American the front-line infantry regiments were handled, the lack of preparedness. This is all the price you pay when you have an army that's not up to the challenges of current events. And you think about the situations we're facing. I'm not commenting on policy or politics, just you think about the world we're facing, and can your army, do what it needs to do and to face these complex situations that we're facing. We'll see.
I don't think it's on.
Hello, we talked about the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, but a larger empire also was the subject of a breakup, and that was the Habsburgs, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And could there be some comment on the impact of what happened to the Habsburg Empire and its impact on current day matters?
Not my field. Sorry. Pass on that.
I think that was last night's people's particular specialty, and I would just say the Balkans, and it sounded like I knew what I was talking about, right?
What is really a shame, though, I believe the country to suffer the most from all this was the Kingdom of Hungary. They lost more territory, and to this day, obviously, they had to renounce those claims to be part of NATO. But the Hungarians suffered the most, ironically, being a second player in an empire that was involved with the war. Clearly, the Balkans is a birth of all this. The seam lines, we've lived that dream in the 90s in Bosnia and later on in Kosovo. I mean, is it done? It seems like a success story right now in the long term, but there was a long, bloody road to get there. And as far as the politics of the breakup of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, you're dealing with ethnic rivalries, and then, of course, all the unresolved issues with Romanians and Hungarian territories and vice versa. So, I mean, that's still there. Thank God that NATO forces many of these countries to come to terms with these, but perhaps the legacy's still there. And outside, on the rim, outside of the Habsburg Empire, of course, you have Ukraine. And what about, okay, that's not a NATO member. What about Latvia, where I'm going, 24%, Russian. So what does that mean? I don't know.
There's a question, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, there's a question in the way back, but you can respond.
But yeah, just if I want, I'll just add one thing. After the breakup of the Austrian Empire, there were a lot of new nations created in the Balkan and north of it, Yugoslavia, with the Serbian dominance, Czechoslovakia, etc. In terms, and as I mentioned earlier, the French, once the US and the British reneged on their defensive alliance with the French, they decided to cultivate the friendship, the alliance of those, it was called the Little Entente, the Small Entente, because they were smaller countries. So they were first a treaty with Poland, I think in 1921 or something like that, then Czechoslovakia, then Yugoslavia. But for the French, it was a way, it was an illusion, because at the same time, they were, there was no way the French could send troops to defend those countries. It was far away, and that was proven in the 1930s when Hitler invaded the Sudeten. The French did nothing because they could not send an army there. So they basically abandoned those three, except for Poland. But again, in Poland, when Hitler invaded Poland, the French did nothing. They could do nothing to send troops all the way. So I don't know if that answered your question, but all those new countries were more or less abandoned by France, who had once pledged to protect them against Germany.
And a side issue of that, of course, is the pockets of Germans left now in small countries like such as Czechoslovakia, which we saw later on Hitler would use as a pretense to invade. And you see glimmers of this. I know, be careful about applying the past to the current events, but you see shadows of this in Crimea and Ukraine for some of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow. So this is why World War I is relevant to us.
Well, you also see some fairly vicious anti-German American sentiment, both during the war and after, right? They're ethnic Germans. Cincinnati goes to from a German instruction for all of their public schools to an English instruction, and people with German surnames are denied the chance to continue to teach. The famous one, of course, about that is that the British royal family is really German, and not that they want to say that out loud too much. And so that Mountbatten is really Battenberg, right? Everybody anglicizes their name really fast. Ford Madox Hofer, the great modern English writer, becomes Ford Madox Ford overnight, right?
One of Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to Berlin, his ambassador to Berlin, came back after war was declared, and he was telling the public, well, the Kaiser told me that he doesn't fear the United States because there's going to be a German uprising in our country, thanks to the large ethnic group of Germans in the United States. And this former ambassador, his name slips me, but he gave a speech saying, well, we have more lampposts in this country to hang Germans from than there are Germans in the United States. And that's how ugly it got. And you can actually listen to this speech online. It's recorded.
There's a gentleman who's been
Way up.
So a big question. I was thinking about war guilt and blaming the Germans, and Churchill, who said the Hun is always at your throat or at your feet, and Richelieu, who said if the Germans are united, France cannot survive, and the Peloponnesian Wars, where the Athenians and the Spartans slaughter each other in the 5th century, and wondering what you thought about the notion that war is the nature of the human condition, and that while we're talking about circumstances, what we hold in the future, while technologically has gotten much more worse, is just a repeat of a repeat of a repeat of a repeat, and that this is the nature of our lives, and that, you know, you look about NATO putting forward troops against the Soviet Union, and Mr. Putin saying, you know, we do have nuclear weapons, which is the age I got brought up in, and whether you all just shiver your timbers every night, waiting for the end of the end.
Doug, you're the shiver my timbers person, I think.
The party favorite, the nukes. Yeah, thank God the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. One of the greatest highlights of my career was when the Iron Curtain came down. And, granted, I spent just the last couple of years that it stood on there. And when it came down and looking into the eyes of the recently freed East Germans and others, and at first they were afraid of my soldiers, but then we started engaging them in German, and looking at the joy in their eyes and the hope. And, but now we're back to another dangerous situation, possibly another East-West confrontation. And a non-response to a crisis is a response. How does your potential adversary, read a lack of a response? Are we seeing the current situations in Europe and the European powers' response? Is this what the world's going to look like without the United States active in European politics? In the shadow of World War I, a lot of American veterans and people were very upset that Europe went sour in their minds. And the famous cliche used at the time, we tried before in Europe, and what did it get you? That was the famous thing, what did it get you? So anytime you try to talk about European intervention, what did it get you? And it just shut everyone up. And interesting enough, people would call back to President Washington's farewell address, not being involved in foreign entanglements. Of course, he was talking European foreign entanglements. That didn't stop us from being involved in Asia and in Latin America with the Monroe Doctrine and other places. But we tried it, it didn't work, so the United States withdrew behind its border, and what a powerful message that sent to the European leaders. It left the French bare, it left the British a bit befuddled, and as far as Germany, that was to be determined until they had a powerful dictator. As far as a response to Russia, I don't know. This is a big issue. And this is a part of a long story going back some 100 years now. We had a reprieve for 20-some years when Moscow was cooperative with the rest of the world and with the West, especially Washington, D.C., cordial relationships, resolving hard issues in the Balkans. You could argue that the Serbs would have never given up Kosovo had Moscow backed them up. But thank God Boris Yeltsin saw a better world and was able to basically tell Milosevic to just back off. But we'll see.
If I may, I'll just add something about the guilt and that blaming the Germans for the majority of the French were saying the war was caused by the Germans. As a people, as a nation, Wilson had a different approach. For him, it was the military-industrial compared to the old regime, the imperial military regime that was to be blamed, but not the German people, and that explains his policy in Versailles. The French went, no. The Germans will always be a warlike, a predatory nation. The only group in France that agreed with Wilson were the French socialists, who were, because of the Marxist approach, saying war are created by economic capitalistic interest. Now that the Kaiser and the military clique that surrounded him have been removed, Germany is a social democracy. We need to encourage them. And so the socialists in France are the ones that consistently support Wilson all the way to the end of the Versailles Treaty. When the Versailles Treaty is signed, the socialist newspapers are saying, this is not going to bring peace. It's not Wilson's fault. It's our fault. Our own imperialists, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and everything. And what is interesting as a consequence is 2 years later, the French socialists, the party splits, and a majority of them joins the Third International, the Comintern that had been created in March, because they think that since capitalism is unable to bring peace, Wilson could not. It was the last hope. The only hope is the Comintern, and so the split and the birth of the French Communist Party, which is probably domestically one of the major consequences of the war, comes from that. Because whom to blame? And the French were saying, no, the Germans will always be dangerous, warlike people.
There's a lot of wrestling with this right now with the 100th anniversary commemorations. You're seeing at Verdun, for example, the films that are being shown are readjusting our ideas about how to understand the war, and a lot of that has to do with identifying with who actually was conscripted to fight it rather than the leaders. So you're getting a different kind of, 100 years on, thinking about this differently. The Germans lost a huge number of people, the Russians the most of all. It seems in some sense bootless to sit around and figure out whom to blame when you're standing, in the dust and an ash heap of the entire Europe. I mean, Wilfred Owen likens it to a biblical thing, to Abraham and Isaac, and instead of Abraham deciding not to sacrifice him, deciding to sacrifice him even though God stays his hand. And he says, half the seed of Europe, one by one. His idea is there is a bloodlust there. It's important to identify with not the political leaders, but the people on the ground who are fighting it. We should probably take, one or two more
We have
questions?
time for 2 more questions.
Another outcome of the First World War was an entirely new idea of how to organize international politics. Instead of secret treaties and great power diplomacy, the idea was put forward of a League of Nations where you would have public diplomacy and any aggression against another state would be stopped by everybody else, snuffed out instantly. Now we think that's very idealistic. Was it really doomed from the start? And of course, we all know 20 years on that it did finally collapse in certain special circumstances. Was it doomed from the start? Or was there something in there that was worthwhile that we could grow upon?
It's a great question. Any of our politics
Well,
people?
from the perspective of the Arab lands that were under European mandates, they weren't terribly useful because the structure of the League of Mandates was that if residents of Syria, Palestine, Jordan, or Iraq had a complaint about the mandatory power, that complaint was to be handed to the representative of the mandatory power ruling over them for them to dispose of. So,
We do have Geneva Conventions. We do have some, if we're talking about broad international attempts to try not to make exactly the same mistakes again, we do see outlawing of poison gas and other kinds of munitions that had been used for the first time. It helps to go over a line to see where that line is and then pull back. A lot of this is about the money, right? And the final fork in the League of Nations was dealt in the U.S. Senate and not by any of the European powers. A lot of this has to do with American exceptionalism and the idea that we don't want to play with anybody else on a team. We would like to be the team itself.
If I may add, what comes out in the newspaper of the time, which is the documents that I researched, the main criticism of people who are opposed to the League is that the League had no bite. There was no military power to back up the Leagues, and that people saw that as the major weakness of the League of Nations, which the United Nations did not later on. Having said that, the League had some small success. Of course, we think of the great failure of the Ethiopian War, and then, of course, Hitler and Mussolini, but there were some minor issues that were, so it could have worked. Had it not been for the 1929 crisis and the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, it might have worked. I think that I'm a little bit of a revisionist, saying that it was the treaty was the best that could be achieved given the fact that everybody had to make compromise. And there's an interesting book by David Fromkin called In the Time of the Americans, saying this is one of the few cases in history where a country was given a second chance to do things right. After World War I, Wilson could not impose its will to especially to the French and the British, because the question, how many men did you lose compared to ours? And so Wilson was forced to make compromise on the League of Nations and this and that, and as a result, the Versailles Treaty was a mix of things that were not idealistic. In World War II, the US was absolutely able to dictate its will and thus created a free Europe and a democratic and a peaceful Europe to this day. I'm not talking about Eastern Europe. So, long answer to your question, there was some good to the League of Nations, I think.
Yes, my question is for Professor Cummings. You started out with Sykes-Picot. Predating Sykes-Picot was the McMahon letters, where England got all the Arabs in to fight against the Turks, and they returned for that. They were promised all the Arabian Peninsula with the exception of small parts in Lebanon. Have you read the McMahon letters, and have you seen the maps and studied those?
what was the last part?
Have you read the McMahon letters, and have you looked at their maps to study how
Sure.
that fits in?
Sure.
Would you comment on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, the British had entered the war, and they were seeking to maximize their leverage against their adversaries, so they promised everything to everybody during the war and figured we'll cope with the fallout if we end up victorious. So when the Ottoman Empire entered the war against the British tried to foment rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. And they found a likely traitor, you might say, to the Ottomans in Mecca, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who was willing to launch a revolt against Istanbul in exchange for a British promise to support his bid for an independent Arab kingdom after the war. And this is the correspondence between Sharif Hussein and British High Commissioner in Egypt, Henry McMahon. And the British also promised to divide Arab lands that they had promised to Sharif Hussein. They promised the same Arab lands to the French. And when it came to Palestine, which according to their agreement with the French was to be an international zone, the Foreign Secretary in 1917 made a promise to establish a national home for the Jews in that very same territory. So Balfour, after the war, basically said, look, we promised a lot of things to a lot of different people. It was war. That's, well, I think any power would do that. I don't think it's particular to the British. Not to let them off the hook.
I was going to say, they are pretty good at that, though.
Okay.
That may
All
be the
right.
last word.
Sure.
Thank you for coming tonight. Thanks a lot.